Workers who clean up crime scenes, what's the most insane thing you've witnessed? A quick content warning for this one in this thread. There are multiple mentions of murdering, dead bodies, autopsy, and disgusting details and descriptions of crime scenes. If for any reason you don't want to hear about any of that, it's all good. Here's your warning to click off the video. That being said, here we go. Crime scene cleaner here. My first cleanup was quite an experience. Man shot in the head in his garage. I'll never forget needing to use pliers to pull teeth out of the drywall behind where he sat, where that red liquid managed to make its way more than 50 feet across the garage. Most disturbing, though, was his pickup. We chose to take it to our company wash bay to pressure wash it and make sure it was as clean as possible. I cleaned it myself and was satisfied that I had done well. Inspected for blood and couldn't find anything, so I began driving it back to the owner's garage. On the way back, a slight drizzle began and switched on the wiper blades. Imagine my horror as a chunk of something looks like some matter streaks across my newly cleaned windshield. I pulled over quickly and cleaned it up, but it still makes me sick to think what would have happened if it didn't rain that day. This man's poor wife or daughter would have been met with that sight and been crushed again by the impact of death. That 10 years ago, and I'll never forget it. Now I triple or quadruple check every job. Story 2. I don't clean up crime scenes, but I do remove the deceased. I can get into more accurate detail of the deceased, but here's some general stuff. Hoarders are a lot more common than they really should be, first of all, and it's never a clean hoard. It's piles of junk covered in several types of crap and vomit. Molds I've never seen before, and probably insects that haven't even been discovered yet. I understand when the emergency services don't want to be in that kind of house longer than they have to, but I'll never forget having to ask them to help me because I couldn't distinguishing what was actually the deceased and what was just a piles of random crap that looked more human than the deceased did. People will warn you bodies will bloat, and touching them the wrong way will make them leak. But the image you're conjuring up doesn't even hold a light to what it can be like. Insects skittering when you delicately lift a 400 pounds deceased onto your cot, because one wrong move and they will start oozing. Story 3. My job is to clear landmines. I clean war crimes, you can say. Yeah, a bit of a stretch, I know. Recently, a cow had walked into a minefield in our area of operations and stepped on a small anti-personnel mine. However, this mine was boosted by having been buried on top of a directional fragmentation mine. Gamers and soldiers. Think Claymore, but bigger. The cow had literally been split in half, hanging from trees like Hannibal's Christmas ornaments. Story 4. I occasionally work on the weekends for a funeral home. It's decent money for what is essentially 2 hours of call-out work when their normal staff is off. Last year, I was called in at around 5 in the morning. A 30-something-year-old guy had died in a pretty small 2-bedroom apartment. That wasn't the bizarre part at all, since I've seen it before on call-outs. What was bizarre was what was in the apartment. Literally thousands of documents piled on the floor, on a desk, on shelves, of people's financial information. Credit card statements, bank statements, personal data, etc. Probably 3,000 folders with all this stuff in it. Even where there weren't piles of folders, there were just loose papers, magnetic cards, surveillance cameras. It was just the weirdest thing I've ever seen. And of course, some of these documents and folders had red liquid spattered all over them. Didn't matter to me though, since the detective on scene had said it was fine to take the body. The police had to clear a path by collecting the papers from the route we would take from the door to the apartment to where he was. A couple of months later, it came out that the guy had over $1 million in cash and Bitcoin. Apparently, the state police were onto him. Story 5. A friend of mine is a firefighter, and he told me about a scene of a wreck he showed up to. When he arrived, there was a Corvette smashed under a trailer of an 18-wheeler. When they finally pulled the two apart, the driver of the Corvette's body was intact in the front seat with cell phone in hand. Meanwhile, his other part was in the back seat. Turns out he had been going at least 70 miles per hour while texting and didn't realize there was a red light and rammed into the back of an 18-wheeler. Story 6 was dispatched to a vehicle versus pedestrian call a couple months ago. And when we arrived on scene, it was like something out of a movie. Dude was running across a fairly busy 4-lane road and was hit by a car traveling about 55 miles per hour. After his body went through the windshield of the first vehicle, he then proceeded to be thrown into the opposite lane and was ran over and drug about 20 yards by another vehicle. It was a fantastic anatomy lesson. Story 7. I used to work in forensics picking up decedents, as well as assisting the medical examiner in conduction of the autopsy. Cause: exsanguination complicating transverse carotid and jugular severance. Just want to address anyone who is asking about it potentially being a homicide and give a little bit more background info. I was reluctant at first to give out too much detail, but here's what I'll offer. There was a call to a Section 8 development about a man down the hall acting extremely erratically. He had no known history of substances abuse and no diagnosed psychiatric illnesses. His mother, whom he lived with, as well as many of the neighbors, called 911 multiple times and first responders were allegedly taking their sweet time getting to the scene. He lured his mother out into the hallway and then ran back into the apartment alone and locked the door behind him. He then ran to the kitchen, grabbed the knife, went and turned the shower on, and did the deed. He was picked up by EMs and brought to a local hospital where he was pronounced DOA due to his injuries. No preliminary toxicology was conducted by the hospital. His remains were then picked up by us for examination. Unfortunately for the conclusion of the story, this happened on one of my last days of work, after I already put in my 2 weeks' notice. Thus, I don't have access to the postmortem toxicology report to find out why he did it. If the tox is negative for illicit substances, we may and will likely never know why he actually did it. My personal hypothesis was that he suffered from some form of developmental disorder, and combined with a latent psychiatric illness of some sort, compounded with an unresolved body-gender dysmorphia complex, was unable to cope with his feelings and broke. Story 8. I don't clean them for a living, but had to clean a few apartments when my uncle managed an apartment complex. We had one tenant out on sick. He sat there for roughly 3 weeks before anyone noticed the smell. They took his body and left it to us to clean up. The dude vomited on the ceiling. There were little dry droplets of vomit all over the ceiling right above where he and left a puddle of unknown juices on the concrete foundation underneath the carpet. I thought that crap was left to a professional team, but I guess it's optional, and if you don't want to pay for it, you can scoop that crap yourself. Story 9. Okay, not a crime scene cleaner, but I'm a medic. Have a few bizarre ones. Came into a home to find a man who putting a pistol to his head but had a second thought. He ended up having to crawl 5 feet away to where he had thrown the pistol after only blowing the left side of his face off, but stayed alive. People really don't understand just how messy a pistol or shotgun can make things. Think the Hulk smashing a blood-filled piñata. And this one was more weird than anything, but here goes. Older gentleman we were called to after police performed a wellness check, late 70 AH, UBS. Nice house, nice foreign car in the driveway. Pictures of prayers and crosses all over the house. We had into the bedroom, and there he is naked, except for what I assume was one of those sexy nun-Halloween costumes. Honestly, I don't know, but he ended up having a heart attack mid-pleasure time. Definitely one of the weirdest things I ever saw during my time working the box. Story 10. I've got a ton. I used to do CSI work and was an autopsy tech. So I would both go to the scene, investigate, bring the body back to the morgue, and help with the autopsy. When you have a body exposed to the elements, you have normal decomposition to look forward to, such as insects, bloating, gases, etc. Once you've seen a few, then you know that this kind of decomp state of body is normal, and you know what to expect. There are varying levels of stuff you deal with, but it's all within an expected spectrum of the job. Hope that makes sense. However, in this case, this person was sealed in, so you didn't have any of that. They were essentially stewing in there for almost a year. It might have been longer. I don't remember the exact time. I wasn't there on scene when they found the person, only in the morgue to help with the autopsy. So I prep the room, doctor comes in, and I pull out the body from the fridge and wheel them into where we do the actual autopsy. Opened the bag, and the smell, I'll never, ever forget the smell. I've dealt with bodies in various stages of death, but crap, this was on 10 other levels. Now the morgue has air filters, fresheners, and all that, but they weren't effective at all for the smell. It was so bad I gagged, which I've never done before, and almost threw up in my mask. The doctor was struggling too. The doc double-backed and almost looked like they were gonna faint. It was the purest, worst, most concentrated, extremely pungent ammonia smell you could think of. I had never smelled anything like that in my career at that point. If wine ages well and is better with time, this ammonia smell did the exact opposite. And it was somewhere worse than anything you could think of. The smell stuck to us too, on our skin, for about a week no matter how hard I scrubbed. I can still smell it if I think about it. The texture of the body didn't help either. It was so slippery and wet that flecks of the ammonia fluid splashed onto my skin. The long gloves went up to my forearm, not all the way to my scrubs. It was the worst autopsy of my life. It took about 3 hours because we kept having to take breaks, and it was a difficult body to work on due to how fragile it was. It beat out everything else I saw, from the crazy accident fatalities to interesting murders. Story 11. Okay, here's another story that will always stick out. The entire residence was absolutely tossed, as if someone was looking for something, however. This wouldn't end up being a typical robbery-turned-homicide. This was about to be way more bizarre. We get the man into the bag so crime scene can take their photos. In the nearby toilet, we discover even more red liquid, possibly up to at least a third of this gentleman's entire volume of In the John. It was just around that exact moment where another patrol officer was perusing around the residence when he started to find random objects covered in fecal matter. Eventually, he found more objects with a mix of fecal matter and red lick. It then hit us just exactly what we were dealing with, extreme violent with foreign objects. Most of the objects were reasonable, I suppose, smaller objects resembling the phallic shape, TV remotes, things of that like. Well, 3 of the objects stuck out that were discovered are what make this story. The first was a broom. Sure you think. Kinda skinny, right? Can't be that bad. Well, it was the depth up the grip of it that we were concerned about. This man definitely had his bowel perforated. The second object of note was a baseball bat, the contact end of it. Again, pretty deep, but significantly wider in girth. The final and most standout of the objects was a guitar. A really nice Stratocaster, too. The tuning end of a guitar, the tuning S, were all covered in a thick paste of fecal matter. At autopsy, the findings were obvious. The assailants have been apprehended. Story 12. So, I work in healthcare. Crazy stuff comes in all the time. One time, a woman came in who was shot in body. She was dirty and only a bra. I thought she was a escorts, tossed from a car. Turns out she was drinking with her BF and another guy. She and the BF got into a fight, like, serious fight. The BF starts choking her out, so the friend runs upstairs, grabs a gun, and tries to shoot out the legs of the BF. Well, he missed and shot her instead. Took a bit of explaining to clear that up. The lady did fine, considering. I don't know all of the legal consequences or how all of that worked out. Story 13? Oh boy. Bringing back memories. I was on my way with one of the detectives, since they said there was no need to take my car. After they finished up making a few assumptions of what happened, they let me clean up. I looked and saw a nude man holding a fork inside an outlet with a metal chain around his neck. But I will never forget the smell of this crap. Story 14. My friend wasn't an official crime scene cleaner, but he drove a tow truck, and they often had to deal with some gruesome aftermath. The worst one was a man we had both met before. Recently married, baby on the way, seemed happy enough. They found his car parked down in a secluded spot by the lake off a major highway at one of his favorite fishing spots. He had shot in the body and was found days later when the car was reported as suspicious to the police. I happened to be riding with my friend that day, chilling and helping him unlock cars and bring people gas and whatnot. We got a police call, usually just towing a car from an accident or because the driver is drunk. Because of the death location and the proximity to heavy traffic, they had us tow the vehicle to our lot, which was nearby, in order to wait for the coroner and better get him out. So there, we found ourselves towing a vehicle with the dead body of someone we knew in the driver's seat. It was surreal. The worst part was the next day when his pregnant wife wanted to get items out of the car. She asked for his favorite hat. The shop said they didn't see it, and she couldn't go to the car yet. They told her they would call her if they find it and spent the rest of the day trying to decide what to do. Since the hat looked new, she said he had just gotten it earlier that month for his birthday, they located a brand new one at the local mall, and a few shop techs wore it around for a couple days to try to make it look used. They then gave her that hat instead, and said they found it in the glove box or something. It just didn't seem right to give her a bloody token of her husband's recent death. She was so happy they had found it. Truly heartbreaking. My friend was a bit messed up for a while after that. It really made him more angry than anything. I never told him I had considered it as a teenager. If I had had access to a gun, that might have been me in that car. You just never know what people are dealing with. I hope the wife is doing fine now. Story 15. I'm just trying to do my part to get actual crime cleaners here, but I'm a medic, so similar, I guess. One time we found this guy dead in his home, in the corner of the living room tucked around the couch. Ass up, no cloths on. Literal coffee ground looking crap spread everywhere across the house. On the floors, furniture, walls, everywhere. Along with mass amounts of liquor bottles and glass everywhere. He had massive G issues along with drinking to the death. Don't know what was worse, the smell or the scene. Story 16. I was at this house cleaning up a death. It was a beautiful young woman in her 20s who had killed with her prescribed antidepressant. The investigators had left, so it was just me and my partner there. We just had to put her in a body bag and take her to the morgue. I went out to the ambulance to get the body bag stretcher, walked back in the house to see my partner abusing the girls. The strangest part is that he seemed like a totally normal dude. I would have even said we were friends. He's in prison now. Story 17. Craziest crap I ever hear as an EMT in training was a cops and EMTs responding to a gunshot wound. Cops where I live have to clear the scene first before medical personnel can go in. They find the guy, head completely. Two boys scared crapless hiding under their beds after witnessing him dead. Medics where I live are legally required to check for a pulse. As one does and the other, they are tandem, calls it in. Said dead body stands up and sits back down. Then does it 2 more times. The last one puts its hands out like Frankenstein. Keep in mind there is nothing from the jawline up, the second officer said. If he does it 1 more time, has shooting him. As morbid as it is, I laughed at that part. Story 18. I was at a scene recently where someone jumped off a balcony onto the street below. The balconies of the 2nd and 3rd floors extend out further than the others. Another one that I attended a few years ago was a death attempt in a nursing home. The only problem was that the wounds were too superficial. She had a bit of time to kill, so she made herself a smoothie, watched some TV, went to the bathroom, basically just going about her normal day. She eventually changed her mind and called for help. The company I work for doesn't usually clean up crime scenes, but it's something my boss has been trying to get into for a while. We have gone and done a couple of bids. Usually when we show up, the crime scene is over a week old, sometimes two. This one in particular, a man murdered his girlfriend and confessed the next day, so it was about 3 or 4 days old. As a fire department chaplain, part of my job was clearing the trauma from the room, so I think I count. I've cleaned some real messes, shotgun homicides, but most disturbing for me was a car accident wherein a little boy died. The wails of the mom, her desperate rocking and tight grip on her child, and the smell and look and feel of death on a person who hadn't even yet experienced life. It was wrong. It just felt wrong on the most primal level for me. Story 19. I clean up biohazard material, dead bodies, for my company on occasion because I'm one of the only two that's certified. I and my coworker went into a house to clean a body, but the boss failed to mention they had been dead for 2 weeks. Okay, whatever, I can deal with that. We walked to the house, and not only could you smell it from the start of the driveway, but all the windows were black. Okay, this dude had blackout curtains, I understand that. We suited up and went into the house, which was relatively clean given the circumstances. We knew he died in the bathroom, so we made our way upstairs and followed the flies. So, you know how flies swarm decaying things? Yeah, it wasn't blackout curtains in the bathroom. The windows were caked in so many flies that sunlight couldn't come in. My boss also failed to mention he died in the bathtub. You hear about bloating and blah, blah, blah. Story 20. I do clean up crime scenes, but the best job I've done wasn't a crime scene. An older gentleman ordered a lady of the night for a good time back at his hotel, popped some Viagra, and while they were doing the deed, something in his banana ruptured. It looked like Dexter's playground. The guy survived. I guess the injury wasn't as bad as the scene would suggest, but it was that an intense job. Story 21. Not me, my roommate. Used to clean up crime scenes and all that. Says the worst was the autoerotic asphyxiation guy who died with his Deakin hand. Well, rigor mortis kicks in, and this guy's hand muscles end up clamping down on his unit hard. Well, roommate and 2 other crew members are on scene to clean it. One of the other guys was apparently new and was going to attempt to move the guy from his hanging perch. Well, because the deceased had clamped down on his unit with the strength of a lobster claw once he was moved, apparently his DK kind of exploded like a literal overfilled sausage. From what I understand, the blood was trapped from flowing back into the circulatory system by the lobster grip, and due to how long the guy had been hanging there, it apparently became very rainy and engorged with BD. It wasn't nearly as shocking as Mr. Lobster Claw, but was emotionally ducked, and Rumi couldn't keep doing the work. Further update. Rumi filled in a few more deets on the autoerotic asphyxiation guy, apparently found after 2 weeks of being dead. Guy was in his own closet, peeking through the cracks of his own door, watching 18-plus movies on a TV in his room, lived alone, and was creeping on himself. Said the DK looked like a water wiggly. Story 22. I posted this years ago under a deleted account, but in my early 20s, I got a job cleaning up water and fire-damaged properties from a buddy of mine. I'd been with the crew for about 3 months when we got called out to my first fire damage situation. So the boss calls us into his office that morning and gives us the scoop. This, he says, is a delicate situation. The house that we're going to be clearing out is a murder scene. It had belonged to an elderly woman who had sometimes rented out a bedroom to some drifter fellow. Well, this drifter fellow had disposed of the old lady and locked himself in this home. After some days, neighbors called the police to report that this woman hadn't been seen, so the police came by and knocked. No one answered. Then the bathroom blew up. Apparently, the drifter didn't see many options left at this point. So he emptied diesel fuel and gasoline into the bathtub and took a hot bath. So the fire crew comes out and puts out this fire. They sweep the house, find no survivors. The police crew comes out. They sweep the place, find all finds of melee weapons and craziness strewn around the house, but no old woman homeowner. The house gets boarded up and shut down for a month while they complete the investigation. Then it gets reopened for family to claim whatever belongings they'd like to. That's where we come in. We get to be on site to move any contents out of the location back to our shop and clean the nasty, sooty grossness off everything. Then return it to this poor woman's family for them to remember her with. So, this place. Wow. From the outside, it looks like something out of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. A broken chain-link fence scarcely hiding a few scraps of grass in what was once a front lawn. Broken concrete path leading up to a front porch with an honestly welcoming doormat. Funny that. Now remember, this place had been on fire in the beginning of May. Then the electricity and gas were shut off, and it was boarded up for over a month. Opening the front door to this place felt like breaching one of the 7 seals. If a house could be said to belch, this one did exactly that. Fire, ammonia, and rot. So onward we went with dust masks on and flashlights, floodlights to help us through this place. I saw some of the most disturbing things I've ever seen. In the living room, it was dark and cluttered. I saw right away the baseball bats, axes, and crowbars next to all the doorways. That drifter guy was really just waiting for someone to come calling for him. My buddy and I grabbed the couch to move it to the dumpster out front, and it starts to shake violently. We dropped the thing, and at least 3 cats ran out of it and out the front door. followed by my friend and I. Scared the crap out of us. We get back in there and find that those weren't the only cats. Feline carcasses in the bedrooms, in the kitchen. There were meat hooks hanging from wires in the kitchen. Nothing hanging from those, thankfully. I'm fairly certain there was a cat in the crisper in the fridge, but it was more soupish than anything definable. In the backyard and in the shed, cats and cat crap, and ugh, what a horrible smell. So, we're clearing out this place, salvaging what's salvageable and disposing what is disposable when the poor elderly homeowner's elderly sister finds the missing homeowner. In a chest, in the bedroom, under some debris that the fire crew created when they knocked the roof in. Crap. After that, we got to call it a wrap temporarily. The police crew got called back out again, and we were called back 2 days later to complete the job. I'm just glad that I wasn't the one who opened that chest. Story 23. Hey, one I can answer. I clean up crime scenes. You find the obvious stuff like sex toys, substances, paraphernalia. One time I found a maybe fictional, maybe autobiographical journal of how this guy lost his finger in an angle grinder accident. This same guy had a small metal pipe, like a WD one-hitter, along with some kind of dried fruit, like cherries or small plums, hidden in a box in his closet. It was like he was smoking it? IDK. We are pretty versed in the world of substances, and we couldn't figure that crap out. What's strange to me is that a lot of adults go to their parents' house to dead. Kinda ducked up. Death season is not during the holidays. We are way more busy during spring than the end of the year. The most eerie thing is how often we dead in rooms that just look norma. Hell. It's hard to explain, but it's just strange to go into a normal-looking bedroom with a half-drank Gatorade on the dresser, a half-read book on the nightstand, and a big old red liquid stain on the floor. Also seen the different ways the families cope with the tragedy. Our service is expensive. And there's been times I thought I was going to get hit when I told them our estimated price. Especially if it's grandma or grandpa that swallowed a bullet and half the ducking family tree is at the house. You get the people that are just on autopilot that ask weird questions because they really aren't on the same plane of existence. We tear out all the carpet in a room if a gun is used. CSF is clear and is also a BBP carrier, so if it looks clean, it might still be contaminated. We've had the carpet pulled and removed, and I've had family members ask, while they're looking at the slab concrete, if we are just going to shampoo the carpet. You get the people that seem almost happy that the person is gone. I've heard people say, well, now that their kid is gone, we can finally take that cruise. IDK if it's just a coping mechanism, or if they're just massive holes. I try not to judge, keyword, try. Story 24. Not me, but I knew someone who worked at the medical examiners. One of the cases was a man who had passed away in his home, can't remember how, but anyway, he had been there a couple days. The body had been there long enough for it to start to swell with liquid, and when she went to turn him around, his part popped like a freaking water balloon. Story 25. Obligatory. Not a crime scene cleaner, but my dad was a fireman and had some stories similar to ones in this thread, so thought I'd share. One of the worst he ever told me was when working at the Black Saturday bushfires here in Australia. He was doing some checks in houses they had the fire controlled in. They went in 4, 5 houses and found no one. Then they went into the last house. It was my dad and 2 other guys searching. My dad opens the bathroom door to see a lady holding on to 3 very young, between 1 and 5 years old kids. The lady was still alive, but very badly burnt. In complete shock. Apparently, she didn't even react to my dad opening the door. Story 26. I went on a few ride-alongs with the county coroner. Worst was a woman that slid her hand and maybe panicked because BD was on every inch of the bathroom. She fell into the tub where she died, but she left bizarre notes everywhere, leaving things to people, like her used hairspray to an individual and why. Just lots of post-it notes for her garbage she left to people. Story 27. A family friend removes the deceased from their homes, etc., since they own their own funeral home. They said that the weirdest thing they saw was a woman lying face up in a tub and a man laying on top of her. When she took them apart, she knew why they were like that. Guy had domestic abuse problems and they were going through a separation. Kids in the other room, mom in the bathroom doing her hair. The guy comes in and just beats her several times, puts her in the tub and places the knife in her hands while he jumps on top of her. She said she'll never forget how sad and unusual it was, especially for those kids who thankfully were asleep. I think her mom found them. I hate thinking about it, and I hope that family can heal. Story 28? Oh man. Taking me back to the good old days, aka 5 years ago. I found an arm in the ceiling rafters. I had a hoarder threaten to cast spells on me. I found dead cats, very often. I've been attacked by a cat. I found a massive 18-plus movies collection in a deceased pastor's home. A huge collection. Pretty sure I've seen Ghost. A suitcase full of human goop, and so much more. Now I'm going to eat my lunch. Peace. Over 4,000 bottles of pee in a house. This hoarder was a NASA scientist. A hoarder once was using Whataburger cups as her bathroom. Damn. So many cats, man. I cleaned up a crime scene 2 hours after it happened, and the most bizarre was a death that looked way too much like a covered-up murder. But who am I to ask questions? Story 29. I'm a fire investigator. My worst one was a lady who committed death by in her basement. When I got to the scene, the body had already been removed, but there was a clear pattern on the floor where she had died. An empty can of gasoline was nearby. Her glasses were gently placed on top of the water heater. On a table were several ritualistic books. Some passages were highlighted, involving ridding yourself of the darkness by performing the flame ritual and other culty stuff. So, to perform the act, she removed her glasses and placed them on the water heater. She doused herself in gasoline. You could see that she ran around the room, bumping into things and knocking things over before finally falling down at the center of the room, meeting her fate. Mental illness is some serious crap. Story 30. So this happened to my roommates and I. I won't go too much into details, but we'll still give a crazy outline, and it's still long, my bad. We had just moved into our apartment and was warned by the landlord that our upstairs neighbor, whose family had lived in this apartment and owned it their entire lives, caused a lot of problems for other tenants about noise and such, but was told he was currently in an eviction process by his brother who owned the building. So not to pay much mind if he complained to us about anything. We had some run-ins with him throughout the next couple of weeks due to TV too loud, slamming doors, laundry being done too late, etc. Very minor things that we had no control over, but obviously this was something he had high sensitivity to, so we would do our best. One weekend, my roommates and I left for an out-of-town trip, and so there was no one in the apartment. We came back, and over the next couple of weeks, all of a sudden started to have a fly problem. It got so bad that we were killing them groups at a time, making sure there was nothing in the apartment, leaving, then coming back to a new swarm. Yes, this is gross. So we kept calling the landlord, telling him obviously we are not messy people, and need it to be fixed ASAP, all while being asked if we've heard the upstairs neighbor at all, moving out / seen him around. We started to realize we hadn't seen him like we always did every day. His stairs run parallel to my window, so I would always see him go down them if I had my blinds open. I realized I hadn't seen him. I also began to realize his windows had been opened in the same place for a while now. But at this point, I'm still not thinking of anything morbid. Anyway, few weeks go by, and before I leave to go out of town again, I deep cleaned the apartment because I felt gross, making sure there wasn't a single fly. No trash, etc. Come back after 3 days to find another cluster. I was furious and called the landlord to hire someone to get rid of this issue. He asked a couple questions about our neighbor again, saying he was supposed to be gone, and they can't physically interact with him unless they bring police, but to keep an eye out, blah blah. So my roommate and I decided to do some investigating since we were fed up with being asked, and just was curious at this point. Worst thing that happens is he's there and just yells at us to go away. I watch way too many crime shows, so I already knew what steps we needed to check on. We first noticed the windows. We went around back and saw there was a crack in the window, but couldn't remember if that had always been there. We then proceeded to the side of the apartment where his living room window was above ours. I climbed up the fence to get a better look, and that's when I saw hundreds of flies swarming against the window in between the blinds, trying to get out. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I then thought maybe if we checked dates on his newspapers upstairs, which I could see had began to pile, we can see how many weeks are up there. I went to look, and there were 3 weeks worth of Sunday papers. We freaked and then called the police. Called the quick finish up. Emmets got there busted into the window because no one was answering, and the landlord was going to take too long to get there with a key. Our neighbor ended up dead above my bedroom ceiling, literally the weekend we went out of town. The cop told me a few more weeks, and he would have been through my ceiling. He immediately realized what he just told me was not okay to say to someone. But I think those guys are just so desensitized to these things he didn't realize until after, and then he apologized. But it took me a long time to recover from that. Story 31. Back in the day did kind of this work. Cleaned up a homicide where guy goes back to woman's apartment, start fooling around, finds out woman is actually a cross-dresser, so kills the person, then tries to cover up the murder. Many different types of dildos throughout the apartment, and huge amount of wigs burn into the carpet to the point it was so heavy, we had to cut the carpet in small pieces due to the weight. Story 32. When my mother died in the garage, we called a company the police recommended. The company was very respectful of the situation. They literally cleaned that 2x2 piece of garage down to scouring the floor. Think scorched earth level cleaning. I don't think anyone in my family was emotionally ready or able to enter that garage to clean up what was there. Again, thank you for being strong for those of us who cannot. Story 33. Not even close to crime scene cleanup unless you consider the poor ducking tow driver that has to tow homicide cars, trucks. Had a pickup with one rider from police impound. I get there and a wicked paint job on this car. Weird patterns over white paint. Interior was a purplish color. Not putting 2 + 2, I got in, noticed the glove box open with a handprint on it. 3 seconds later, it hit me. The flecks were what was left of him. The cool paint job was powder for prints. Needless to say, cussed out my boss to the I should have been fired area. Burned my clothes and showered for hours. Mind you, this was put through a auto club. Some hole out here took that call and didn't even add hazmat label to it. Story 34. I'm an estimator for a biohazmat crime scene cleanup and restoration company. While I usually don't go on site, I do have to pick through the extremely detailed and graphic photos of the scene to determine what we will charge for the cleanup. Of course, there's red liquid other bodily fluids covering the surfaces of the rooms where people die. What's shocking to me is how many people just want it cleaned and will return to the home immediately afterward. A son died in his mom's bedroom, and once we're done with the mitigation, she'll be back in that room in 2 days. Also, the price. We bill the homeowners or insurance companies usually no less than $25K due to the specialty equipment and processes we have in place to do the cleanup. It's so expensive. And what I hate the most is sending these grieving parents or victims an astronomical bill for cleaning up a murder. It just seems so wrong. We have to get paid, of course, but I don't think I'll ever be comfortable with that. Story 35. Not me, but a friend of mine interned at the local ME office. One day shared with me that they were called on scene to collect a body. Guy died of a heart attack completely naked on the couch surrounded by 18+ movies. Last thing he yelled at his wife was, "Just leave me alone," before shutting himself in his den. The weird thing was his wife hadn't checked on him for a couple of days and just left him there before finding him and calling the police. Oh, and there was a cat box in the corner of the room with crap in it. The wife reported that they have no cats. Story 36. I have a company that does property preservation, which means we clean houses for banks after they have been foreclosed on. We have found several bodies in the houses, and we're at a property where the foreclosed homeowner dead in front of us. One was a transit living in an abandoned house in the winter. He was also dodging warrants. He had taken a refrigerator box up into the attic and pulled the insulation all around it. Had a sleeping bag and Coleman lantern inside with him. The cops said it looked like he had been using the lantern as a heat source and carbon monoxide poisoning. It was summertime when we got to the house and the smell was god-awful. It took a while to find him, but the bed RM ceiling was stained from his juices leaking through. The coroner removed the soup and the wet sleeping bag, and we removed the insulation and drywall and the carpet as well, then redid everything. The second one was an old guy that went to Arizona every year and was getting ready to leave when he died in the hallway of his home. All of the neighbors thought he was in Arizona and didn't think anything of it. We found him a year later covered in books and the house ransacked. The local druggies had broke into the house, discovered the body, and covered him in books. Then stole his gun collection, coin collection, and dildo collection. Yes, that's what the cop told us after they caught the thieves. Sad part was the books were worth more. Then the guns, coins, and dildos many were rare. The last one was just a couple of years ago. We had been in contact with a guy for what's called a cash for keys, where the bank pays you to leave the property and remove everything on your own, usually between $3,000 to as high as $15,000. It is cheaper than an eviction. This guy was the son of the owner who had passed away several years earlier and had lived in the home rent-free for close to 5 years while the property went through probate. We had offered him the money and he had agreed, but when the date came to inspect the property and give him the check, he wasn't ready and said he changed his mind. So the bank spent more time, about 2 months, getting the eviction writ and posting the property. The sheriff went out to serve the guy the eviction papers, and from what we were told, had a good talk with him. On the day of the eviction, we waited on the street in front of the house to move any belongings out to the curb. The cops usually give the owner a couple hours to remove their most important items. Then we move in. Not all but most cops doing the civil side of law enforcement are older and heavier, and that's who we had today. As he knocks on the door to let the owner know we are there to begin, the guy opens the door, real fast, takes a step out, puts a revolver, and fires. It was so fast the cops were just standing there like, what the hell? Story 37. I used to do first calls in Portland, or FYI. First calls are the folks who represent a funeral home company and go to the place of death to pick up the deceased individual and transport them to the funeral home. I did that for a couple years and collected a lot of stories, but there is one that may seem insignificant in terms of gore or whatever, but is the one case that is still crystal clear to me. First of all, Oregon has this thing called death with dignity. Essentially, if you live in Oregon and have been diagnosed with some terminal illness, you can seek out a special doctor who can prescribe you an intentionally fatal medication, allowing you to die on your own terms. This is also known as assisted homicide. Midday in the summer of 2015, my partner and I arrived to a house in an artistic suburban Portland neighborhood. We were greeted by a grief support volunteer who introduced us to a man, the husband of the deceased whom we were there to pick up. The volunteer lady did all the talking for the widowed husband, as they do in these situations when they are asked to. We got our questions answered and the husband signed. Then we were directed to where our passenger was. She was in the master bedroom at the end of the hallway. Along the way, there was an endless collage of finger paintings and macaroni pictures and family photos of this family of 4, a husband and wife and their 2 very young daughters. I learned the girls' names from their heavily decorated bedroom doors, each of which was on the way to the master. I saw into their lives in that relatively short walk to the master bedroom. I was always a bit nosy in these situations and picked up on these details in people's homes, but I was really focused on it all in this case. When we met the deceased woman, she looked comfortable. Judging from the collection of prescription bottles and medical equipment in the room, I assume she was seldom comfortable. Her nails, and finger for that matter, were painted crazy colors, and under a daisy-chained flower crown was hair that looked brushed and like it was dyed with Kool-Aid and washable markers. I still imagine the last makeover party this loving mother had with her daughters. I can hear the stories she might have told them about her big day, and that she would be going away to live with their ancestors. I'll be honest, this was a really emotional call for me at the time. Still is. No other call had ever made me pause and consider mortality as much as this person did. If there is an afterlife for all of us, I greatly look forward to meeting that person again under better circumstances. You would think with having such an impactful experience with assisted homicide that I would have an opinion one way or another, but I don't. I know it might now be as bizarre as some, but as someone else had mentioned in the comments, a lot of that gory, bloody stuff becomes business as usual after a while. This experience was super weird to me in that I had formed somewhat of an emotional callus when interacting with descendants. Regrettably, even to the point where you forget that they are people. On that call, I was hyper-aware of her humanity, and it was difficult. Story 38? Not my story. Essentially, a friend of a friend's. Someone called 911 reporting a stench in a flat below them. EMTs and the like show up, find a guy who had been left in the apartment for a couple weeks. The guy had drank in Drano, the drain unclogger stuff. There was a trail of red leading across the bedroom, and his body was crouched in a corner. Story 39. I don't clean up crime scenes, but my parents did when I was a kid. There was a gun-inflicted homicide, and they got called in, so they went to clean and whatever. They got home late that night and brought the shop vac in and told me not to touch it. I asked them why, and they informed me that it contained some matter from cleaning earlier. This isn't exactly what was asked, but it's something I won't forget. Story 40. Used to work with a volunteer firefighter in my previous job. He told me about a local crash in our small town that ended up trapping the driver inside a burning car. After they were able to put the fire out, they had to retrieve the body inside. Only way to get to the body was to cut the roof off the car and pull the body out. One of the firefighters put his arms underneath the guy's armpits and pull him out. After they cleaned up the wreck, some of the volunteer firefighters stopped volunteering. Story 41. I worked in restoration for about 4 months in college one summer and ran into plenty of bizarre messes of mold, piss, crap, and every biohazard in between. While they were rare, we did occasionally get jobs to clean up crime scenes after the investigation had finished. In my 3rd week on the job, I was asked if I could handle something like this. They told me what the job was and what I would need to. It was a murder, and there was red liquid covering the majority of the victims, one that was killed, bedroom and desk. When one other technician and I showed up, I did not know any of the details of the crime beforehand, but found out pretty quick that the situation was 2 males who had been friends for some time, both in their 20s. One of them had been in a long-term relationship with a girl, and the other began seeing her on the side. Eventually, the relationship heated up, and the side guy went to his friend's house to kill him. And after finishing, he went back to his car and shot. When we showed up to the house, I was greeted at the door by the kid living there's father, who said he has not been upstairs since his death and wouldn't go up with us. It was incredibly surreal talking to him, and we had to stay professional and treat it like any other job. When we got upstairs, there was way more liquid and matter than I had anticipated. Because his family was claiming everything under insurance, including desk and its contents, I was tasked with cleaning the desk as well as going through every item in every drawer determining if it was salvageable or not. In that desk, along with copious amounts of weed carts, were dozens of love letters exchanged between the girl and him. Admittedly, I did read one of the letters and opted to keep it and possibly show it to the father. I was 18 years old and not aware of what that would or wouldn't do the father, but seeing that kid's room, who was around the same age as me, with almost the exact same interests according to his bedroom posters, really messed with me for a while. Eventually, I threw the letter away as I had learned the case had been closed already in an article online, and I figured that it would be better for the father to forget about the entire scenario surrounding his son's death. Story 42. I interned at a small-town morgue, and mostly did boring paperwork and cleanup throughout the day. Until one fateful Tuesday, both my bosses decided they'd let me tag along to help transport the deceased. Bizarre is an understatement as to what we saw when we pulled up. It looked like white smoke was coming out of the front door of the home, but the fire department was nowhere to be seen, and there was no sign of a fire. All of the people that would step out of the house had white stuff all over them. The entire inside of the home was covered in flour, It was thrown against the walls, poured all over the floor, tables, chairs, TV. There were even patches of flour on the ceiling where someone took fistfuls and tried covering the damn light fixtures. I didn't go through the entire house, but every room I looked in as we went to the bathroom where the deceased was found was also covered in flour. Whatever you're imagining, multiply that by 10. I couldn't tell you the color of a single thing in that house. We eventually were handed masks because it was becoming difficult to breathe. Anytime we'd turn around or take a step, it'd send clouds of flour into the air. Empty flour bags thrown everywhere. In case anyone is curious, the deceased was a middle-aged woman. I overheard an officer tell my boss to wait before collecting the body. I think they were calling in a different investigator. They originally assumed the death was natural because she had heart problems. Not sure how they knew this, but the condition of the home suggested someone was attempting to cover up a crime. Story 43. Just a soldier, let me tell you about my friend's death. Chronological order. My battalion gets back from a non-combat deployment, training for Afghanistan. About a month later, soldier posts some death stuff on Facebook, gets in his Jeep, drives into the desert and kills. We had our entire band looking. We had Apaches in the air, hackers from our sister bands looking for his phone, computer. He died. Week later, another guy, fresh from AETT Basic, and I are called to clean his room. Emotional. I was friends with the soldier since around the middle of our rotation. Never suspected anything was wrong. I'd even gamed with him a couple times. When I got into his barracks room, I was just struck with the fact that it was eerily similar to every other soldier's room. My room, friends' rooms. I know this isn't gory, but goddammit, 5 minutes earlier and we would have found him in time. 5 ducking minutes. Most people don't even sweat being 5 minutes late to work. I was so pissed at the SFC in charge of us cleaning. SFC is like my boss's boss's boss in this case. She was of the mind that we throw everything away. I yelled at her a couple times for object he literally bought overseas for family members. I swear I almost fought this woman, so blazy about the whole thing. His room was messy, not overly so. Just normal 20-ish-year-old weekend messy. I found his notebook, diary. He was struggling for years. Since childhood, there was nothing wrong. He and his father liked to smoke. He had bought an expensive pipe for his father, a flask for his grandfather or something. In his notes, he talked about not blaming anyone. His overwhelming depression wasn't keyed or hooked on anything. For the love of all that is good. Check in on people. Superficial, hey, how's it going? Does not ducking cut it. 5 minutes. Be their friend. 4 or 5 moments. That's all it takes to become a hero. Colossus. Story 44? Not a crime scene, but my mother used to be a nurse. She was in the room when a doctor told a man that the reason he'd passed out and had migraines was because he had terminal brain disease. His wife had a packing license, and while she was in the gift shop, he died. Another instance. My dad is an orthopedic surgeon, but during his residency as a general surgeon, an EMT crew came into the ER and called for a doctor. My dad said that was strange because they'd usually call for someone specific or they would wheel the patient in first, but when he got out to the ambulance and looked inside, they told him that they just needed someone to see it to decide if the car accident victim was even able to save. He told me he couldn't even register the mangled pile of muscle as a human being for a solid 30 seconds, and he just turned to the EMT and said, no. This all happened before they had met. Actually met changing a bandage, but that's another story that's actually very cute. But they tell me that those instances are the things that still keep them up at night from time to time. Apparently, you get used to it. But I told them I'm not going into the medical field for that reason, and they laughed and said it was definitely not for everyone. Moral of the story, though, don't pack in a hospital. It was the late 80s, and wear your seatbelt. Story 45. My pops was a funeral director for a while, family biz. He had stories very similar to some of these other ones. Porters who were overweight and filled with decomp gas. You have to basically spear them to let the gases out in order to get them out the door. An old man who was a shut-in died in front of a huge southern-facing bay window in the summer. Took 2 weeks for anyone to notice, and they found out by smell what happened. My dad and his crew had to go in like full biohazard outfits. He said he was able to do and handle a lot. Clear bodies on train tracks, murders, etc., etc. But one of the hardest things he had to deal with was a young girl had been murdered, and that same week, a dad in his 40s who died of a massive heart attack while putting the star on the Xmas tree in front of his family. My dad had recently become a father at the time, late 1970s. My older sister was about 2 at the time. After that, he was pretty much done with the family business. Started working in sales. I think it shook him a little. One story I won't forget. He had to pick up a body of a guy who was working on his house's siding and hit a nest of hornets. They stung the guy so many times in the face and neck. Some got into his mouth and stung his throat and was blueberry blue from the oxygen deprivation. My dad told me this when I was 7 and we were cleaning out a wasp nest. Needless to say, I had a crippling fear of anything with a stinger for a solid 5 years. Like, what a crafty way to go. Story 46. My first homicide cleanup was from a Glock. All the matter splattered everywhere. even across all of their wedding photos. That's not the weird part, though. Before he did it, he took off every single thing on his body and in his pockets. He folded all of his clothes to an almost military perfection and set them on the dining room table in a perfect line. Watch, wallet, money, and all personal items in a similar fashion, right next to the clothes. I often wonder what that brief period of time must have been like for him. Story 47. Not me, but a buddy of mine. We'll call him Larry. His brother owns a funeral home and oversees the morgue at the local hospital. Sometimes Larry picks up the call-ins, mostly late night. Well, one night he gets a call to a very rural part of hillbilly country. Larry arrives at the home, but no one's there. Certainly no body. He calls them back, and they direct him to the barn on the other end of the property. Once located, he gets out of his car to an officer who tells him he's not ready for this. Now, Larry does this a lot. He does this. So Larry's first thought when the officer said he's not ready was, dumb little softy. Then he walked into the barn, a barn filled with puke and crap, chicken crap and human crap, puke and crap and feathers, and one human male corpse covered in puke and crap and feathers. Larry said the smell was so unbearable that he walked out and called his brother and told him to hire someone else. He quit. Story 48 was a volunteer FF in a very small town in MO. Got an unresponsive person's call from dispatch and met with the local sheriff outside of an elderly home/apartment complex. The unresponsive patient was a woman in her mid-50s, and her apartment door was locked. The lights were on in the house, the ceiling fan was on, the TV was on, the gas stove had a pot on the burner. Everything suggested that she was fine, except for the flies on the inside of the windows, and the fact that the pot of water on the stove was glowing red hot. The lady's neighbor said that she had passed by a couple of times throughout the week, and everything looked normal. But when she knocked on the door, nobody answered. The sheriff and I busted down the door, and the first thing to hit us were the flies, leaving like a cloud. The smell was extremely bad and continued to get worse as we entered her bedroom. There she was, laying in the fetal position on her made bed, covered in mucus and black, stringy goo on the wall closest to her side of the bed, and next to her was a Tupperware bowl that she had been coughing up what looked like pieces of matter. The coroner showed up and determined that it wasn't foul play, and asked me to help get her on the stretcher so he could take her to the morgue. She had been for about 3 days, so the rigors was the worst part, even worse than the smell. We had to physically stretch her out in order to get her out of the fetal position. It's a sound that I will never forget. She was a heavy alcoholic and smoker, apparently died from kidney failure. Story 49. I don't clean your crime scene, but this is a house in my city, my neighborhood. Old house, last known occupants were 2 elderly, unmarried sisters in their 70s. Sisters disappeared in late 1990s. In 2000s, pest exterminators going into the abandoned house to fume it found one skeleton on a toilet. Police arrived, cleaned up remains. 10 years later, house remains abandoned with original hoarded stuff inside. Decides to clean up the hoard and finds another skeleton under the stuff. Story 50. While I do not clean up crime scenes, I do pick up the deceased at crime scenes after they have concluded their investigations. The most usual thing seen is blood, bodily fluids, waste leakage, the look of horror on their faces versus people who just look asleep. The most unusual thing I have seen at a crime scene is multiple people dead from gunshot wounds, and a person laying in that pile without a scratch, dead. That person was the shooter. Apparently, he shot up everyone. And as he was reloading his clip, standing over the bodies, he had a sudden heart attack and collapsed right then and there on top of the victims. Talk about an agenda being suddenly cut short unexpectedly. Story 51. I participated in one once, and the oddest thing was the feel of the room. It was a murder, the body had been removed, and the physical damage was limited to a small bit of carpet and subflooring in the closet. But the place felt heavy, like you could feel in the air that something really bad had happened in that room. And I legit got the willies and had to step outside for a little while. I felt really stupid about it all, but spoke to a few people who work more frequently in that practice, and they had experienced the same thing at one time or another. Story 52. I do not clean up crime scenes, but the company I work for receives newly wrecked cars and resells them in auction. My job is to clean and inventory the car for upcoming auction. I can tell you now that I have seen some ducked up and creative ways people go to die in their vehicle. We call them death cars. Now, I won't go into vivid detail for the family's sake, but I had an SUV last week in which the back seats were all down, the floor and seats all covered in well-placed and folded blankets, and the front seats even covered in trash bags. The door jambs has folded towels for extra cleanup, and covered the back to small windows with a type of window tarp, and they died laying down. Just yesterday, we had a very much 100% mangled truck in which a young lady was died. I was told not to open up the black garbage bag inside the vehicle due to some matters being inside. Yeah, I see some crap. Please be careful on the roads. Story 53. Not me, but my dad used to work in mortuary services, or the dead man taxi, as he used to call it. Loads of stories, but the one that stuck with me was when he had to go pick up a jumper who had landed on a wrought iron fence. Broke like every bone in his body, but didn't puncture anything on the fence somehow. The way my dad described it, it was like trying to handle a beanbag chair. Story 54. Here in Texas, one of my relatives, as a teen, was cleaning a gun with a friend over that he didn't realize was still loaded and accidentally fired. You'd think there were people, crime scene people, that would come in and clean up for the family. And while there are companies that do this for a fee, they couldn't afford it, and all his brothers and sisters and other family members had to do it. One of them is broken inside and describes it very detailed. I can't imagine having to clean a loved one's fragments and matter off the walls. This was before I became a part of their family, and when we would visit, from when my son was just a baby, he would not go in this room. He didn't even know what happened yet. Story 55. My father was a sheriff's deputy for 20 years and saw some pretty bad accidents. But the worst thing he saw was due to a natural disaster. He was doing welfare checks after a tornado had gone through a small rural cattle farm, and after driving up the driveway, he saw cattle and pigs littered everywhere, many still alive and missing limbs and matters falling out. The oddest part, though, is the house as completely untouched. Not a single missing shingle or broken window, but the barnyard and barn were completely razed. He said there were easily 30 head of cattle and at least 10 pigs that were killed, all of them. Story 56. I'm a volunteer firefighter. Had one call for a vehicle fatality last month where a woman was ejected from the driver's seat of a minivan. She went through the windshield and landed on the hood. There was red liquid everywhere, running off the hood and into the grass as well. It was storming that night, so a lot of it got mixed with the rain. Story 57. I don't clean up crime scenes, but my driver's ed teacher in high school was good friends with a Dewey homicide photographer. The guy would come scare the kids every semester with gnarly pictures of people involved in fatal Dewey accidents. The one picture that never left me was the motorcyclist who hit a pole face first going 100 miles per hour. It was like human wrapping paper. Story 58. Not me, but a friend of mine does body cleanup and recently told me one of the weirder ones. This guy died in the shower with the hot water running and wasn't found for over a month. He basically was absorbed by the house, the entire house. Technically, if there are biomaterials left from a body, they need to cut that out and medically incinerated those materials, since he was basically absorbed into the entire house. Floorboards, walls, doors, ceiling because of the hot water. They ended up removing what was left of the body and then they burnt the house down. Story 59. In the early aughts, I had a roommate who worked for a funeral home and would sometimes get called in to take bodies to the coroner's office. On Halloween morning, he got just such a call and he said it was the freakiest crap he'd ever seen. The woman was a very devout Catholic, and she had been praying at her little prayer altar when she had a stroke or something and died. No one discovered it for several days, so when he got there, she was still posed in a praying position. He took a Polaroid, even though that kind of crap is strictly forbidden. He showed it to me, but she looked kind of slumped over. Still eerie, though. Story 60. Dude rigged a whole room into a tease of some kind with pulleys and ropes everywhere designed to lower himself onto objects when he pulled his arms down. It had a toilet seat and such for him to sit on. Apparently, the old school glass Gatorade bottle he was lowering himself on was too much. So now I'm looking at a dead, and his family is screaming outside while a VHS tape of the animated Hobbit movie is playing in the corner. Damn humans. Story 61. My father was a firefighter in Texas for 30 years. He and pretty much all of his officers were EMT trained as well and would ride an ambulance a few times a week. They got a call to a house in Las Colinas sometime in the mid-70s. Old kid slipped in a shower and was unresponsive. The dispatch neglected to tell them that the kid fell through the plate glass shower door. Tempered glass wasn't the norm yet. Dad came straight home to see my eldest, then just a baby sister, took the enclosure off the upstairs shower and replaced it with a shower curtain. Said he didn't sleep for the next few days and over a 30-year career remained one of the worst things he ever saw. Story 62. A firefighter buddy told me about how a guy came down a common shortcut side street in our town in an MGB too quick when another car blew a stop sign and ended the forward momentum of the wee car, but not the unbelted driver, his body. His head hit the upper part of the windscreen and kept going, right onto his own lawn. His wife came out to see what the bang was and found it. There is now a traffic circle there. My wife knew the kids from school and they were irreparably traumatized. They came out to see why Mom was bawling and she tried to keep them away but couldn't. Fire rescue was first there, and my friend said it was the worst one. Story 63. I don't clean up crime scenes for a living, but my car got stolen by a homeless addict and later recovered by police, and I was shocked that when they returned it, crashed, not in driving conditions, that they left everything in there for me to clean. I had to pull out an entire pill container, several used needles, and other disgusting crap. I had no idea how to dispose of it safely.